I live part-time in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I've also lived in Utrecht for a couple of years. And of course, Dutch cities are innovative in terms of thinking about privileging cycling and pedestrians over cars. And in Utrecht in the 1950s, they cemented over a canal to build a freeway through the city to link it to other cities. And just about 4 years ago, they decided that was a huge mistake. They needed to go back. They needed to make it more pedestrian friendly. And so they reclaimed that by rebuilding the canal and making pedestrian and cycling ways alongside the canal. So that's one thing that you can try to do, is get cities to redesign their spaces to make them more friendly. Well, thank you for what you do with Momentum. I'm going to jump to the relationship between walking and art making, because there is a long history of relationship between walking and various arts, whether that be poetry, literature, visual arts, music. And one of the things that kind of got me to be thinking about the exhibition was going back to Baudelaire and the idea of the flâneur, and the idea of this privileged male figure who was able to amble through the streets of Paris, not having to worry about a specific destination, but just to move freely on his own. And then, of course, the argument, well, is there such a thing as a flaneuse? And I don't think we need to address that argument anymore, because, of course, there are women who walk. And we have Mary Jones, for example, who has built an art practice around her walking. So one of the things I'd like to ask is, what is the relationship between the everyday, the quotidian, and art making? And specifically, what is your relationship to walking and developing an art practice around that experience?
Should I switch to the slideshow?
Sure. If it's what Mary thinks is a good thing to do right now, yeah.
Well, I think sequentially, didn't we put Alex's slides first?
Did we put Alex first? Sorry.
Not
so
sure.
Let me then direct that to Alex. Thank you for joining us from Brooklyn today. And I know you're a native Iowan.
Yep, I grew up in Grimes. So
fantastic.
Still have a deep connection with Des Moines, big time. So
do you want to talk a little bit about Pedestrian and your art practice?
yeah, so I have a background in sculpture, and through doing that work, I was kind of in a studio a lot, and I kind of felt like I wanted to be more out in the world. And I guess I was thinking of the material I was using in my studio felt like it wasn't right. And I actually wanted to be more like out in the world, interacting with the city. So then when I moved to Chicago for college in 2010, that was the first time I ever started really walking around the city. Growing up in like Grimes, Iowa, a very rural, car-centric place, I'd never really walked around, you know? So it was the first time I discovered the joy of like moving to the city. And then I started thinking about the walk as like a way to generate material for a artistic practice. So at first I started a magazine called Pedestrian magazine, which was basically a magazine for people who like to walk in the broadest sense. And I invited a lot of artists to contribute and kind of think about how they move through the city, how walking like was incorporated in their own practice. And it was really just a good way to engage with the city. So then through that, my work really became about documenting my walks. So a lot of the work I do now is generated through walking, and it's in the form of mostly writing and photography. And I think of artwork more as like an artifact, the result of an activity. Oh yeah, so this is a walk I did. I was walking around New York City a lot during the pandemic, even before the pandemic. And I started to think to myself, like, what would happen if I walked to another city? So I walked from Brooklyn to Philadelphia in May of 2021, and that was 160 miles over 9 days. That really got me thinking about where I could also do that. So I walked from Brooklyn to the end of Long Island, which was about, forget how long that was. I think it was like 160, but I started to think more about spending time in one place. Because when you're walking from, let's say, Brooklyn to Philadelphia, you're actually moving pretty quickly, even though you're on foot. You don't have time to really stop and get to know a place because you've got places to be every day. So this slide is from a walk I did in LA last March, where for 7 days, I walked in 7 different directions. And so it was the first time I really did a whole walk like this in one city, like with a very much like an intentional, like I'm just going to walk this city for 7 days straight, document it. And then every day I would send a newsletter to people who had signed up just about what I'd found. Oh yeah, and these are just photos from the walk. So very much just snapshots from what I saw from the day.
Well, LA famously has um, created out of what was once a natural river, a concrete river, the LA River, that you had an image of that earlier here.
And going back to the first question you asked Alec, I think also with like making cities more walkable, it's one thing to like build out the infrastructure. And I think that's really important. But even here in Brooklyn, for example, I'll walk 10 miles to like Coney Island or something. And a lot of my neighbors who don't have cars and do walk a lot to like the grocery store or um, like the laundromat and stuff like that, like they just don't think walking is a viable means of transportation, really. So when I tell them you can walk 10 miles to the beach, which is a lot, some people might not be able to do that, but um, I think it's also changing people's idea of like the ability to walk and that you can walk. Because a lot of people right now just they really don't even think it's an option. We live in a society that's so like car centric that it just seems absurd to walk.
Um, if I was just curious also to ask about, um, I think Momentum DSM definitely has a political component to it. Do you consider your practice, your art practice, Alex, something that is also politically engaging?
Mm, I don't think I'm overtly saying like I'm anti, like I'm not, I think it's the work in a way is it's like another, I guess, way of being. I'm not overtly saying like I'm anti-car highway, even though I'm very much kind of against highway infrastructure and a car-centric society. Um, so I guess it's like there's a political nature of it embedded in the practice of doing, like walking to Philadelphia was a very, I think was a kind of, whether I knew it or not at the time, kind of a statement that goes beyond, I mean, it even goes towards like speaking for infrastructure, but also speaking for just wanting to do something in your art making. And at that time, I wanted to walk to Brooklyn or walk to Philadelphia. So yeah.
Great. Mary, how would you describe the relationship between walking and your art practice?
Well, it took me a while to realize that walking was really central to my practice, and it's kind of like Alex said, that's where my ideas are generated. And I walked a lot, and my move was sort of the opposite. I spent most of my life in Chicago, and then came here. And so it was like, what? Where's the, I'll never forget the first time I taught at Grandview for a number of years, and naively, I thought, okay, I'm gonna go wait for the bus, not realizing that there aren't buses every 5 minutes. But I didn't even get a driver's license until 1990. I was 40. So, I had had a lot of adult life in Chicago, basically on foot and public transportation. And the thing is that those two things are kind of a dance. This photo here is a walk. I decided to walk my route to work on 14th Street. I only walked 8 miles of it, but that's not, 14th is not meant to be walked. But anyway, maybe I'm getting far afield of what this has to do with an art practice. Yeah, that's where my ideas came from. And I didn't really become cognizant of it until I read some William Least-Heat Moon and realized that engaging with one's environment in the most basic way, which for me is on foot, is the everyday life that I want to make work about. That's what I want to make work about anyway, the things that I know best. And that is feet on the ground. Then there's lending form to that activity is really a challenge. And Alex showed those. I guess you're going to make boxes as a way of preserving the walk, or so that there's an object. For me, the object is pretty much rectangles that hang on a wall, which is a challenge. So I combine some photographic material and then I superimpose that over a road map. This is one of 7 pieces about the walk on 14th Street. And if you know Des Moines, you'll recognize that really is a map, basically. I mean, I've taken some liberties with it so that it fits. And then another form that I have played with is artist books. And this is a pandemic project. I noticed that, and I live in Indianola, it's, suburban Des Moines, and you just don't see people on the streets. But during COVID, you did. But they kind of restricted themselves to the trails. And walking to me is language. And there's a whole rhetoric of walking. There's surprises, there's turns of phrase, there are sometimes it's thoughts, sometimes it's steps, but the trails, I don't know, they kind of feel like a forced march to me. I would rather determine my own walk. And like and this book is kind of like a trail in that it really only moves in one direction. And so this is only a piece of it. It just keeps going and going and going. I'm a little more, and like what's that forced march in New York City, the High Line.
Oh yeah.
I don't, I mean, it's interesting because there's so much to see and do up there, but it really is a forced march. I view walking as a creative act. And so the pieces that I make have as many twists and turns to them as a walk does. I want to be the generator of what goes into that piece. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was wondering also, and throwing this out to Alex and Mary again, have you been inspired by other movements, art movements, such as the Situationist International, or even surrealists, artists who engaged with walking in a very particular way, drifting? I mean, I think, Mary, you're alluding to not wanting to follow, being directed on your walk, but rather to allow the walk to evolve. So the idea of chance or accident, or, you know, I guess this is an example of the drifting, the derive, moving through a city space, kind of disrupting it sometimes. I mean, an example, instead of following the one-way street, going down opposite the one-way street. It was a lot safer to do as a pedestrian than in a car. But just curious, in terms of your own practices, how you relate to other artists who were cartographers or who were walkers.
For me, though, I come from a sculpture background. I was very interested in like Alan Capra and the happenings.
Yeah.
A lot of artists
Mm.
who kind of jumped into like the object, like immateriality of objects, like not producing objects per se, and maybe forming like fixating more on the experience of art making as like the medium. Think a lot about artists like Hamish Fulton, whose work, I mean, it doesn't even exist almost. It's just anything he makes is from the walk. And a lot of what you see is kind of a common concern when making work about walking, is how do you share it? Because if the walk itself is the experience, like the artwork, like how do you share that? So a lot of the objects shared are more representation of the art itself. Yeah, and like Richard Long, kind of like classic walking artist people. Um, yeah. But I think a lot about archiving. Like I feel like a lot of my work is based on memory. And for me, walking is a great way to generate like an experience, and like how do you recreate that experience? And so these boxes I've been making lately are each box is for one walk. So this one right here is for a walk I did in Secaucus, New Jersey. And I was thinking a lot about how to share that walk with somebody who wasn't on the walk with me. So it's like photographs, a found object, which is a pen I found on the side of the road, and then for a while I was incorporating USB drives with like the actual Strava, the app I use to track my routes, in a field recording. So it was a very fragmented, like a lot of different pieces coming together. But a lot of this work was inspired in like Ankawara, who did the date paintings, which,
Yes.
if you know, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess a lot of the artists I think about aren't necessarily just walking, but maybe come from a practice of trying to produce work that captures an experience,
Mhm.
or is an archive of that experience, or is the result of like an action.
Right.
So,
Yeah. It just makes me think about people like Yvonne Rainer and the Judson Church Dance Theater, and the idea of her No Manifesto, where she's rejecting kind of high modernism and coming back to the body and natural movement. And yeah, and I am also interested in thinking about these as kind of as interventions, and just wondering how you relate. I mean, you've created an archive of objects that you've collected from walks, documentation of walks, new kinds of mapping, the ephemera of the experience is a perfect way to share with spectators, with people who didn't have the experience with you. I guess one other thing I'd like to do before we open up to questions from our audience is to look at, since the exhibition does focus on gender and walking, this exhibition was curated and was informed by the work of many feminist geographers who critically assess the myriad ways gender and patriarchy and other intersecting forms of social power informed by race, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, disability, heteronormativity, among others, are actualized in and through space. And I'm just curious to, bring up the question, if anyone would like to jump in and address the relationship between identity and walking. How do you see, as you navigate your way through the city space? How does identity play into that?
I mean, that's like a big question, I think.
Yeah, it is.
One, I can't speak for other people really, but I know through the work I do, like I walk through a lot of different cities and different spaces, and even living here in New York City, it's just a certain identity I have as like a male, I suppose. There's certain things I don't necessarily have to worry about that say other people would. Yeah, I think everybody's experience, the woman's experience moving through the world, people of color, yeah, people who don't have the ability to walk. I mean, I think it radically different experiences the world. So yeah, I think I have a very specific experience that I can only really speak on. So.
Well, Mary, I know that we've talked before about the idea of kind of masquerade, dressing a certain way on your walks. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
I I tried, I have experimented with that some. Dressing specifically to walk has been something that some artists have done well, and in particular, earlier walkers, 19th, early 20th century women would sometimes dress in men's clothing in order to be safe. So I mean, that person that I draw is basically the work uniform with pens and pencils. Because I have to have drawing and writing tools because I stop along the way. But I did, it didn't take me long to figure out that the only pedestrians on 14th Street in Chicago, I mean, in Des Moines, are at 2:30 in the afternoon, the kids getting out of East High School. Other than that, the only people that you see are people who probably wish they had cars. And they're just, you just don't see, like me, older women at all. So I tried wearing your basic plaid shirt and stocking cap. and khakis, which is kind of a 14th Street dude uniform. And I've tried wearing dresses. I'm not really sure why, except that it's the first walking I really remember is walking to kindergarten.
Mhm.
And that was such a long time ago that was, girls wore dresses and that was the deal. And I couldn't walk. I had to follow my sister, you don't walk with your older siblings. They don't like it so much, but there was sort of a march of girls all in their dresses. So I've done a little with that. Something Patricia and I have talked about. I noticed I've done some walking projects with students at Grandview, and apparently they're told, if they aren't from Des Moines, that when they move to campus, that neighborhood is not safe.
Mm.
It is safe, I think. I don't know. I think there's someone on here. If if Amy Getty is still here as a guest, she used to walk around that neighborhood all the time. The only places that aren't really safe, I think, as a woman on the Grandview campus, are the parking lots. Apparently students' cars get broken into a lot. But I don't know, they sent us statistics on crime in the area, and none of it was, people were not assaulted. It just didn't happen. I've always felt pretty safe walking. But then, I no longer walk at night alone. I've never, I don't know, I've never been assaulted. Alex, it was that incident in Baltimore in a heavily populated area?
Oh yeah. I was in Baltimore and I got assaulted on a walk. But that was like in a touristy area, which coincidentally seemed like, even here in New York, I feel like Times Square there's more incidents of that happening. But I think what you said about the Grandview campus kind of raises an interesting question about, or like thought, these areas that a lot of people cast off as maybe, I'm not sure what word to use. They avoid them or they're very misunderstood. And I think the act of walking in these places is very interesting, just to, like, for example, here in New York, people do not like Midtown. They think Midtown is like the worst part of New York City ever. So of course I plan group walks in Midtown now. And we spend time like examining the neighborhood and just getting to know the place and actually forming our own. I mean, you could go on a walk with me and then be like, I do not like Midtown, and that's fine. But I think a lot of these places people cast off as, yeah, bad or undesirable or whatever, can be very misunderstood too. And I think it's important to get to know them. And I mean, Google Maps kind of levels everything out. It all looks the same, and it's just places on a map that nobody knows what it is. And so I think it's very interesting to go to these places and walk them.
I think when you're told, you shouldn't walk there, it's not safe, you need to ask, what is safety? How are you defining safety? And what's the rationale for informing that comment? I think there's a lot of, it seems as though you're supposed to stay in a certain area. Like you live in this area, you live in this area. This district is safe, this is not. And, moving in between these places can become problematic in the way that they're discussed, the way they're talked about. And I think the idea of just getting out there and walking is really important. I think one of the things that I find, I'm relatively new to Des Moines, is that it's just, even though it's a really small city, people are still car bound. And I live downtown, and you do see people on Saturday when the farmers market is happening, but I feel like there's really not a lot of pedestrianism going on here. And I think partly it's because of it's not a very pedestrian friendly city in terms of amenities for people. Even though there's this great sculpture park on one end downtown, I think the East Village seems like the liveliest, most walkable area. Ingersoll, I think they've made a lot of interesting moves, but it's like a disconnect from the rest of the city. There's great bike paths that are separated and secure from traffic, but it's just along Ingersoll for a couple of blocks, and then you have to deal with like the reality of not very friendly walkable sidewalks, and certainly not very friendly cycling areas.
Don't you think that using cars is ingrained in the Des Moines and surrounding population?
Well, I mean, from my perspective as a new resident, yes. I
Yes.
can't say it's ingrained because I haven't been here that long, but it does seem to me that, I mean, I do see people riding their bikes on the trails when the weather's nice, but there's no safe way to really cycle through the city. And I feel like that's a big part of it. There's just, the design isn't there. The security isn't there. I don't trust the drivers. I don't want to be riding my bike next to a car. It's too dangerous, unpredictable. But I feel like with a small city, there's so much you can do if you have the will and you can get the political and financial support. But yeah, I mean, the United States has been sold a bill of goods about the automobile and privileging the car over every other form of transportation. And that's been going on for decades. And, and now we're going to go to electric cars. It's still the car. Why does it have to be a car?
Well, I think for very large cities, the driving is now problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to provide increase different ways of moving around, whether it's walking or electric bicycle or all different types of things like that. At least that's been my experience in a very dense area. And I would think that eventually Des Moines is a fairly dense area for Iowa, and that if politically some of these changes can be incorporated, that slowly it will change the population, how they travel, how they use, bicycle paths or electric scooters and all that type of stuff. But it takes money and it takes a change of opinion by the local government.
Yeah.
I wonder if Alec can address that. I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, when I talk about Momentum DSM, one of the things I say is what I wanted to do to do these changes and to make it a walkable, sustainable community that's not just your only option is driving, is we do have to change the culture. And that culture ultimately locally is set by city council and what they will and will not support. And so that's why we advocate for trying to get local electeds to understand and care about these issues. And to Patricia's point around, pretty much everyone drives here, and it is ingrained, it's generational. It's something that we need to work a lot on here. But it's also, I think, important to understand the context. There's a quote I like to use that I saw somewhere, and I can't remember who to attribute it to, but is to not confuse lack of options for demand. And there really just isn't options for, if you don't want to have a car here, like you can take the bus, but it comes once an hour and probably not on the weekends. And you could try to ride your bike, but again, you have to be in the lane. We don't have separated bike facilities. That was going back to the gender part of this. That was one of my learnings. I used to think that just like painted bike lanes were okay. And then I kind of learned a lot more. The advocates were saying that they're not safe, and vulnerable users, and especially women, do not feel comfortable in them and won't ride in them. And so I've really changed my advocacy to demand more in the last 2 years. And yeah, we don't have enough walkable amenities. When you talk about the sculpture garden, which is, or a sculpture park or whatever it's called, you know, a beautiful art installation. Immediately next to it is 3 lanes of traffic on Grand Avenue, all going one direction. It's basically built to the specifications of a highway right next to our sculpture park. And we're literally like this month fighting to try and change that. And we're still getting pushback from people who just don't want to change. So yeah, it's cultural, it's America. The roots go back. I can talk about all this stuff for hours. The roots go back 100 years, but hopefully we're starting to wake up. You know, even back to Patricia's example around the Netherlands, they had an awakening 50 years ago in the 70s and have been working to change. But what they have now took 50 years to get there. And so when I talk to people, I have to say, like, this is gonna take decades. So I hope you're ready.
I think it's interesting you said generational. It's generational. Like Des Moines in particular, the downtown is a lot of parking lots. And to look at older photos of downtown is just, it breaks my heart almost to see what Des Moines used to be and now what it's used for. It's just, the infrastructure in Des Moines is like, it's so many parking lots, and it's like, I think having that stuff in the city reinforces the car-centric society.
It'll be interesting to see how, you know, a lot of those, I wonder what the vacancy rate is in office buildings in downtown Des Moines. I haven't kept track, but you know, that's going to have an impact because those parking lots are going to need to be repurposed. Because I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I think that many people are going to continue working from home. So what happens? And all of that all of the condominiums that have been built in Des Moines now, you know, you see more, especially on Saturday mornings, you see people, you see bikes. But it's a food desert.
Well, yeah.
You know, I wonder just if some issues are going to be really forced. You know, there are so many people who simply can't afford cars. That's a generational thing. When I was in college, no one had a car. Why? Because we couldn't afford it. It was just assumed you can't afford a car. Why would you want a car? And I know, students, college students cannot afford cars. What the heck? But they don't, you know, the opportunity is not there for alternative forms of transportation.
Well, I just, since I've been here, it's been 3 years. I've seen so much commercial movement away. So there are all these empty office spaces. As you said, they're just like one car garage after another. And in the last 3 years, the developers continue to build apartments in the downtown area, but there are not enough amenities. There's one market downtown that they wanted to close and put a health food market in, which would be a great alternative to a market. So there would be 2 markets. And then they cut back the hours of the one market that is downtown because of crime. But I really hope that young people, I'm putting it on the onus on young people, need to really get involved in local politics. And well, everyone should, but if you're going to affect change, and it does take time, you're right, Alec. I've been so fortunate to experience living in Amsterdam and Utrecht, where it's just a totally different lifestyle. It's all about walking. It's all about biking. And you look and you see 80-something-year-olds riding their bikes every day. So people are healthier, apparently happier. But there's just a lot. It's just about the will and being, I don't know, people need to be educated. How do you make a city livable and sustainable? How do you keep the city inhabitants happy and healthy? I mean, things need to change, I think. So, I mean, I think Momentum DSN is a great, sounds like a really wonderful movement. And maybe this exhibition can help kind of show that walking can be a wonderful thing. It can be a beautiful thing. You can make art if you walk, get out of your car. Are there questions from?
I have a question. So when Alex and Mary were talking about kind of their influences of other art movements or artists doing work about walking and the like, you were talking about artists who were doing happenings in the 60s and stuff like that. And I wonder if there could be a connection between those sorts of things to the advocacy that Alec does. Like that kind of feels like an art practice in itself, the gathering of like-minded people who are trying to advocate for walking or really anything. So I wonder if any of you had a better way to connect those things than what I'm thinking.
I think Alex brought it up too, like happenings from the 1960s. I feel like you could definitely put together events that would bring people and bring the attention of people to the issues and help with some solutions by getting more people involved. But yeah.
Yeah, just the group walks I've led in New York City, for example. Those have been really good. Like people kind of leave those feeling very energized, and they feel like they've kind of engaged with the space they live in another way. Because I think walking does force you to really slow down and pay attention to things. So I guess, yeah, for the work Alec does, I think, yeah, these, at least for me personally, the group walks I've done have felt like a really good bridge to like advocate for walking. And then if you can throw in like actionable things to do, like speaking with city council, I think that could be, yeah, like a powerful thing to do.
Yeah, we've seen, I was just gonna say, I don't know, you know, we've done some social just meetups, which are good information sharing and just that energy of like, hey, especially here in Des Moines, it's like there are other people that kind of care about this stuff too. We had, I don't know what we'll have for next Saturday. We're doing a bus crawl basically, where we're going to use public transportation to bop around the city and go get some food, celebrate kind of small businesses. And it is, I think, less on the art side, which isn't entirely my background, but just more on that community building, and then trying to build a vast, army of advocates that can go out there, attend neighborhood meetings, speak to city council, like trying to turn people out, because it does require public action to make change. And I think the one thing I wanted to kind of just bring this up, because I know there was a kind of question about like how, and I thought there was an interesting tie-in here, because I was reading Alex's walks of his Los Angeles trip this morning, and why that's relevant is Los Angeles just passed one of the biggest public improvements for their walkability and everything. It's called HLA. You can look it up, but basically in California's different. It's not like Iowa and how they get laws stuff done there, but they Los Angeles, like Des Moines, has a plan that says we're going to do all this stuff around walking and biking, and then like every other city, they don't actually do it. And LA just voted to say like, no, we're going to hold you to it, and it was really monumental. I would love to see something like that in Des Moines, but just that how that public outreach can affect change, but it really does require a lot of work. It was a huge effort for them to get it passed, and then I think it passed like 60-40, so it was really awesome.
You know, I tried to like kind of feel out interest in organizing some group walks, and I went to the neighborhood meetings. This is a few years ago, to try to generate some interest, and it really fell flat. But I'm wondering now if, you know, part of that was I didn't know what I was doing, and the other part was I think I can see a degree of separation here. Maybe, Alec, we should talk and see if there's any way to do something during Art Week.
That would be great.
Because that's you know, that's a lot of people who are on one hand interested in the arts, and on the other hand, just as a group of people, tend to want to experiment with anything.
Great idea. Yeah, that's great.
I have a question. A little bit of one. Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering about, I think as artists, we're maybe used to thinking about intention or purpose going into it. So I'm curious, for the two of you, like, so for instance, a walk, will your walk sometimes have a very specific purpose? In other words, like, it's not necessarily I'm going to go for a walk to make art, right? Or maybe the intention or the purpose is to map, or you go out and it changes and it's to collect, you know. So I'm really interested in how, you know, when you change your purpose or your intention, how that changes your perception of your walk. And have you then gone over the same walk with a different purpose or intention and noticed different things? I'm not sure like how tight that question is, but I'm just interested in that part of it, the purpose or the intention. Thank you.
That's a great question, Catherine. You know, I can't predict too much, or else I know I'm getting in my own way. And sometimes, well, for instance, sometimes there's simply nothing to document. You know, I was in Nebraska City for 3 weeks at that residency, and walked nearly every block of Nebraska City. I ran out of time. But I haven't done anything with that, with any of the documentation, so I don't know. I think a lot of it is a function of memory and revisiting. You know, sometimes I don't know why something is important until it sticks in my mind. I like there's for some reason there's something about the Paulina stop in the Ravenswood in Chicago. I don't know what it is, but I had to go, you know, last week I had to go back and see it again, because I don't know. Did that answer at all what you were looking for?
I mean, I think so. Yeah. I mean, that's a purpose or an intention as well, as to go out with an open mind, right? And just be available to the experience. Yeah.
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 I was gonna say in my walks, I'm kind of, Mary, I relate to you at the Paulina stop. When I go back to Chicago, I always go off the Division Blue Line area on Milwaukee. It's like this check-in with the neighborhood. So there's like a memory component to some of my walks. I'm very interested in the New Jersey Meadowlands, just west of New York City, which is kind of this area that was basically the world, like just a giant dumping ground throughout the last 300 years, and it was heavily polluted and a lot of EPA Superfund sites. So a lot of the walking I do over there is, I'm not sure what I'm gonna do with it, but it's just, I'm walking to a lot of landfills. I'm walking to a lot of Superfund sites and just kind of being in that space. I mean, it's a very like people misunderstood space. So I think visiting it changes something for me. And I'm not sure what I'm gonna do with that material, I guess, yet. Um, and then another thing for walking is, I mean, sometimes I do route the journeys very, I'll be like, I'm gonna go from point A to point B today, which is most of my walks. And I think that um frees me up from a lot of like cognitive load. Like I know where I'm going, so I can really dive into the space I'm in instead of having to worry about where I'm going, which maybe is an unromantic way of walking. I feel like I'm not much of a wanderer, honestly. Um,
Mm.
but for me, that really works for me. So, um, what else? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, a lot of walking is about generating material, just like I guess like a painter would paint their studio on a canvas. It's like a lot of movement creates thought and thinking, and so it's a material I can use for my artwork, but it also generates ideas. And from a mental health perspective, not to be like cliche, but it makes me feel very balanced. It's a great way to, yeah.
Yeah, I love well, that's what I mean, like that structure of saying, this walk is just going to be from point A to point B. That's a kind of structure that you're using to guide. And it's sort of like, I don't know, like the Buddhists would do that, right? They just like walk between like this very short, right? Just back and forth and back and forth. But anyway, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thanks.
Well, are there any other questions from anyone? Thank you for participating in this panel today. I appreciate it. And if you haven't had a chance to see the show, please come and see it. It's up through April 13th. And maybe you can walk there.
Yeah, I mean, we're in historic Valley Junction in West Des Moines, and I see Steve is in the in the recording. He's the executive director of the Historic Valley Junction Foundation, and they do a lot of work to help support the neighborhood and the merchants and the community. And he also leads a very great historic walking tour of Valley Junction, if you want to look into that. But yeah, the gallery is open Tuesdays through Fridays from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., 5 p.m. 5 p.m. Yep, and Saturdays 11 to 4, and by appointment. And so, yeah, come and see us anytime.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.